Good evening. My name is Mr. Kleesner. I'm the principal of Catholic Schools of Anderson, St. Mary and St. Ambrose. This evening I'd like to read you a story about my favorite college football team. The title is Win One for the Gipper, America's Football Hero, written by Kathy Jo Worgan and illustrated by Bruce Langton. Like most boys who lived in northern Michigan during the early 1900s, George Gipp played basketball and baseball and football. From the time he was a small boy, George ran faster than most everyone. He could throw a ball farther too, and because he could dash and dodge on a dime, no one could ever catch him. When George was older, baseball was his game. People came from miles around to watch him crack the ball over the fence and run the bases in one easy move. George was such a talented baseball player that when he became a young man, he was awarded a scholarship to the University of Notre Dame. This meant a free education as long as he played baseball for the school. So in the autumn of 1916, George left home for South Bend, Indiana. When he stepped onto the campus for the first time, George didn't know what to expect. One day after class, George and a schoolmate were kicking a football around for fun. It did not take Newt Rockne, the assistant football coach, much time to notice George. George kicked the ball high and straight, and then tossed it far and steady, never missing his target. From not too far away, Newt, or Rock, as people called him, stood admiring the young man. He seemed to be all bone and muscle, yet quick and light on his feet. "What's your name?" asked Rock. "Gipp, George Gipp." Then Rock asked George if he played football in high school, and George replied, "No, don't particularly care for football. Baseball's my dish." "Well," invited Rock, "put on a football suit tomorrow and come out with the freshman scrubs. I think I'll make you a football player." Deciding to give it a chance, George showed up for practice the next day. Once on the field, he raced like a runaway colt, dodging his way through players to make a touchdown. As everyone watched in amazement, George decided he liked playing football and joined the team. In one of the early season games, Notre Dame was matched against Western State Normal. Notre Dame and Western were tied at 7-7. With less than 3 minutes left, the Notre Dame quarterback was happy to settle for a tie score, so he told George to punt, which means to kick the ball only a short distance. But George didn't want to settle for a tie, so he asked the quarterback if he could drop kick the ball for a win. Although the quarterback urged him to punt, George lined up the ball and thought about winning. He pulled his foot back and drop kicked the pigskin with all his might. The ball sailed for 62 yards, soaring over the crossbar for 3 points and giving Notre Dame the win of 10-7. At that moment, Newt Rockne knew George had a special gift. George Gipp played not only with his body and mind, he also played with his heart. The next day, George's dropkick made headlines across the nation as one of the longest in recorded history. Everyone thought George Gipp was a football sensation, and George became a sensation off the field too. When he wasn't playing football or going to class, he played pool or card games with people from town. Sometimes, if he won money, he bought dinner for people who didn't have enough to eat. The students of Notre Dame, the people of South Bend, and football fans across the nation loved George Gipp, and George Gipp loved football. Although it was a baseball that brought George to college, he decided that football was the sport he would play at Notre Dame. In 1918, George's second season, Newt Rockne became head coach of the team. He and George grew to be good friends and football partners. Game after game, George was unstoppable on the field. In October of 1920, George's fourth and final year at Notre Dame, the team traveled to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Tension filled the air as Notre Dame players prepared to meet their long-standing rival, the Army team. As both teams entered the field, the stadium filled with cheers. But when the game began, the Notre Dame players were met with one crushing blow after another. At halftime, the tired Notre Dame team was down 14-17, and it looked like they were going to lose. But George wasn't going to let that happen. When he came out in the second half, he came out fighting like a giant, with quick passes and pounding tackles. George delivered at every step, advancing his team forward. In the final quarter, Notre Dame made a touchdown, and George kicked for an extra point, setting the score to 21-17. But George wanted more. With a fake crisscross play, George and his teammates made one more touchdown. With moments left and a win apparent, Newt called George out of the game so he could rest. George staggered toward the sidelines, tired, bloody, and satisfied. And as he stepped off the field, the entire crowd in the stadium came to their feet without making a sound. Nobody applauded and nobody cheered. Both sides were in such awe of the mighty George Gipp that they honored him with a silent tribute. The next day, newspaper headlines around the country said George Gipp was one of the best football players ever. But several games later, as the team prepared for a game against Northwestern University, George was not feeling well. His throat was sore, his body weak, and he had a fever. Newt was worried. He told George that if he wasn't feeling better when they got to the game, he would not be expected to play. When they arrived for the game, George still was not feeling well, so he sat on the sidelines. But the day had been reserved as George Gipp Day, and people had come from all over to see him play. Wrapped in a wool blanket, George shook from chills and burning fever. But since they didn't know he was sick, fans began to grumble when they saw him on the sidelines. During the game, a few voices started to call, "We want Gipp! We want Gipp!" It wasn't long before more voices joined in, and soon the whole crowd was calling for George to play. The wind was ice-cutting cold, and George's throat felt sharp and burning tight, but he did not want to disappoint the crowd. Near the end of the game, George removed the blanket and slowly stepped onto the field to the sound of great cheers. Joining the other players and gathering all the strength he could muster, he worked to make a perfect pass for 35 yards and a touchdown. Minutes later, he threw another pass, this time good for 70 yards. But inside, George was growing weaker by the minute. 2 days later, a very sick George showed up at a banquet being held to honor the Notre Dame football team. The pain and fever had worsened, so he told Newt that he needed to get to the hospital. By the time they arrived, George was a very sick young man. The doctor said George had a bad case of tonsillitis. 1 week later, the hospital bulletin stated he had pneumonia and a serious throat infection. Across the nation, newspapers sent out word of George's condition, and reporters camped outside the hospital for updates. Meanwhile, George had been named to the All-American team, one of the greatest football honors ever, but George was too sick to celebrate the good news. In his Michigan hometown, the local newspaper office printed cards with news about George and displayed them in the window, changing them throughout the day. As people walked by, they could read about his progress. While George remained in the hospital, Newt was a regular visitor. Over the next 2 weeks, he watched as George's condition grew worse, and the once strong, muscular young man became thin and pale. One night, as the family and Newt stood quietly by, George motioned for Newt to come closer. Then, as Newt leaned down to his friend, George whispered something into his ear. Hours later, the card in the newspaper window of George's hometown simply said, "George Gipp died." Newt Rockne didn't tell anyone what George Gipp said before he passed away. Keeping true to George's last request, he waited for just the right moment to let George's final thoughts be known. And 8 years later, that moment came. Newt was still the head coach, and his Notre Dame team was struggling against the West Point Army Cadets, the rival team George always loved to beat. The Notre Dame team, lacking in spirit, drive, and strength, was behind during the first half, and the win looked hopeless. So at halftime, Newt called the team together in a huddle on the locker room floor. The boys were feeling beaten, tired, and discouraged as Newt began to speak. "Boys, I want to tell you a story. I never thought I would have to tell it, but the time has come." Then he told them what George Gipp whispered to him right before he died. "I've got to go, Rock. It's all right. I'm not afraid. Sometime, Rock, when the team is up against it, when things are wrong, and the brakes are beating the boys, tell them to go in there with all they've got and win just one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be then, Rock, but I'll know about it, and I'll be happy." The players fell silent. As the spirit of George Gipp filled the room, the young men thought about his last words and fought against their own tears. And right then, Newt looked them straight on and said, "This is the day. You are that team." With a roar of determination, Notre Dame exploded onto the field for the second half. The team worked its way down the field until they neared their opponent's end zone. On fourth down, Notre Dame lined up on the 1-yard line, and the fullback was handed the ball. He plunged hard into the end zone, where he slammed himself and the ball to the ground. And as the ball hit the grass, he yelled out the words that would become legendary. "That's one for the Gipper." With new life, the inspired Notre Dame team went on to beat Army at West Point. And that's one for the Gipper, for always.